Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on interdisciplinary legal practice in rural areas. And thanks for hanging in there if you got here early. We're having a few technical difficulties, but we'll work our way through them. I am Michael Hurd. I'm one of the managing social workers at the Washington State Office of Public Defense. And I'm hoping that you enjoy our session today. Real quickly, I'm going to give you a few ground rules before we start, or a few messages. If you could put in the chat where you're from, I think for this session, it'd be particularly important to hear and see where you're from. I wanted to talk a little bit about the ground rules. I think you've all been exposed to them through the last couple of days. Just make sure and please honor those. And I wanted to talk about, this is my fifth ABA conference out of 6. I missed the first one. We will be having another one in 2 years, and certainly hope we can all attend in person. And if you're an interdisciplinary staff, we're hoping to have one next year, or at least that's what I'm going to be advocating for. So look for that announcement at some point. So as we get started here, and we will have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to have discussions. But we're hoping to have an honest discussion about what it's like to do rural parents representation. There's barriers that come with it that I think a lot of urban providers representation don't totally understand. There are lack of services, there's lack of housing, poverty issues, transportation issues, certainly quality of mental health issues. We know that child welfare system is a major accelerator of depression. I've seen data that suggests that 80 to 90% of parents in the child welfare system qualify as depressed under, So, and there's race and equity issues that are really important and have a different dynamic amongst cultural norms in small areas. So I don't know, did we get Alina back on? Is she?
I don't think so.
Okay, so how about we start with Lucia. Lucia, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Mike. I'd be happy to. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to have you here. Thanks for joining us late in the conference. It's been so wonderful. My name is Lucia Waterman. I work as an independent contractor for the Office of the Respondent Parent Council in Colorado. I live in a very rural area, south central Colorado, the San Luis Valley near the sand dunes, for those of you who know Colorado. And I work, essentially we have 22 judicial districts in Colorado. And I think over the past 2.5 years working for ORPC, Office of Respondent Parent Council, I've worked in about 10 counties total. I have some primary counties. I do a lot of driving. And my career has been in social work, both at the local level and at the state level, behavioral services. And it's an honor to be here with you today. Thank you.
Tanya?
Hello, I'm Tanya McClanahan. I live in Olympia, Washington, and I work in Thurston and Mason counties. Mason County is very rural. I'm a parent with lived experience, and I'm contracted as a social service worker with the Washington State Office of Public Defense.
And I think we will wait on Alina. Alina is an attorney that has dual roles. She's a Chief Justice of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Appellate Court, and she's also a managing attorney in Folsom Office of the State Office of Public Defense in Montana. So we're just going to kind of have a pretty informal roundtable discussion and start off with some questions. And again, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll have some time at the end to discuss them. So Lucia, if you're good, we'll start with you. Do you see it being easier or more difficult to work with a parent in a rural area where everyone knows everyone compared with the anonymity of an urban area?
Thanks, Mike. Actually, of course, it's both, right? There's certain circumstances where in a really small community, it can be a great benefit for all of the players in the party to know the person and to know the family. You can build deeper relationships with people, and there's a certain amount of trust that develops. I'd give an example of Fremont County, Colorado. Primarily the Canyon City office is, we've recently started a family drug court there, and we have a magistrate there who's been there for a couple of decades. And of course, we have cyclical parents, sadly, coming through our system. And a lot of the problems have to do with substance abuse use and addiction. But with this family drug court, our magistrate is getting much more personally involved, and he remembers, unfortunately, some of our parents were children in the system 10 or 15 years ago, and he feels a real closeness with them, and he expresses that to them. And I think a lot of our parents are feeling a lot more supported through that process. There's a lot of shame, of course, and reluctance to have to go back into a court when you've been experiencing it as a child. But I think in that sense, being in a small community can help support our parents and build trust. And yet, of course, there are always contradictions. In another small community here in Colorado, it's a much smaller actually than Fremont County, and again with a long-standing judge. And I think that there's, unfortunately, because everybody knows everybody, it's a tiny mountain town, there's some inherent prejudice against, his father was this or her mother was that. And sometimes, unfortunately, then the flip side of the coin is that less opportunity is given to these parents. And so we have to come together and sort of fight off these perceptions that just because somebody comes from a certain family in a small community and you know it, they're not deserving of all the rights that should be afforded to parents. What do you think, Tanya?
I totally agree. I've seen it where, the generational, their dad's dad, was a criminal and this and that. And they're just, I feel like that comes into play into these cases when it has nothing to do with child safety or why the case came into care to begin with, and then I do feel that with like domestic violence, though, it weighs towards the parents better. There's more compassion towards that, but criminal history, not so much. Substance use disorder, I feel like the courts are a little bit more forgiving because maybe this generation can change, but it plays a huge role in it, in your bigger urban communities. I guess feel like the numbers are bigger and they don't have time for a lot of that anyway.
Absolutely right. And in the urban communities where I have worked, as well as rural communities, there's this anonymity that sort of keeps people safe, but doesn't allow you to really have this personal relationship, which sometimes can launch somebody into a recovery, or, like you say, generate a lot of compassion around a long-standing domestic violence situation. There are blessings and curses. Hello, Aldina.
Are you with us, Aldina? I don't think we can hear you. You keep working on that and we'll keep moving on. We're just rolling with the tech issues here. Moving on to the next question for you, Tanya. One of the things that happens in rural areas is you get a social worker that stays for a while, and you have just a few workers a state or county social worker that you can work with. And that can be good and that can be not so good. So what do you do when you have to keep working with the same social worker from the agency that is isn't always family friendly and working with your client, and they're just trying to check the boxes?
Well, I tell my attorneys all the time, challenge accepted. So there's a little training that can go into that. And, I feel like, I try to include them in the process and the group approach, and kind of teach along the way and be real tactful and respectful about it. But one of my personal mottos is, if we're talking about it, we're not doing it. And so I like to put action to things, and sometimes it takes a lot more than that. I can think of a case where I had a dad living in a very rural area, way up in the hills, and he had to walk 1.5 miles just to get cell service. And he was living in a tent. And so he and I had a certain time of day that we would check in, so he's up and around this and that, and it worked for both of us. And long story short, I was able to find an inpatient bed for him, because that's what he was finally ready to do. And the social worker, I will always remember this case. I was so irritated, but the department social worker, said, well, he can just come by and pick up a bus pass. Now, mind you, the nearest bus stop was about 5 miles down the road. Okay. And that's if I can get into contact with him at our check-in time tomorrow to let him know that, even though he's supposed to check in to inpatient by noon. Right. So I was trying to iterate this to the social worker and just say, this is not going to work for him. She's like, well, that's all we can do. He can pick up a bus pass, at the office. So I wasn't really being heard on his behalf. So what I did is I copy and pasted the bus schedule and the times and all the transitions, because he would have to go through Mason, through Thurston, through Pierce County to get back around to North Kitsap County. And so I just copy and paste and put in an email. And I said, if he leaves, if I get this message to him and he catches the very first bus at 7:30 in the morning out his direction, he will get there at 7 p.m. tomorrow. And it's like, I was waiting for a response, and I didn't really get one, because it's like, what do you say to that? So finally, we worked to get him someone that could drive him. So I just called the Department of Social Work and say, can we get a couple gas cards? We have somebody that can drive him and get him there on time. She said yes. That transporter was able to pick up those gas cards 2 days after the fact. And it's just, just those things that I find that cases that don't have defense social workers don't have that piece, don't have that dynamic to really lay it out and say, this is the real of it on the ground. This is what this dad would have to do to get there at 7 p.m. tomorrow.
Thank you. Lucia, do you have any thoughts on that?
I just think that that's such a great point that Tanya makes, because for those caseworkers with county departments who have been there a long time, even though they live perhaps in the same community or in the town that's associated with a rural community, it's easy for them perhaps to lose sight of the practicalities of living up in the hills or living way far out in the country, and that will lead us into our question about lack of infrastructure. I would say one of the things that we have as more of a problem in some of the small rural communities that I work in is just this unbelievable turnover of caseworkers. So instead of the long-standing caseworkers checking all the boxes, we have brand new caseworkers all the time who haven't familiarized themselves with the nature of the local challenges. And they move to a small town, they've got a degree in social work or psych or what have you, and they go to work to do a good thing, right? Being a social worker is a good thing. Debate that, right? But they don't know, and then they're gone. And certainly, I bet you've had this as much as I have, Tanya. Just caseworker after caseworker after caseworker on a case that's going 12 or 18 or 24 months is just incredibly detrimental to our parents. And I will say too, I agree, Tanya. I mean, on those cases where we are able to help represent the parents, just the whole process becomes richer, and we can fill in those blanks that maybe a county or state caseworker doesn't recognize.
So let's talk a little bit about that, Lucia. one of the things that often happens in a rural area with lack of infrastructure and services is you as maybe the support team becomes kind of a quasi-provider. So can you maybe give us an example where you were able to get professionals to come together to better serve a case when that infrastructure isn't there that you maybe have in a urban area?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that thankfully, although it's still a little bit hard to come by in terms of what you're referring to, Mike, lack of infrastructure, you know, we have incredibly limited Wi-Fi services in these rural areas. We have no transportation. Tanya was talking about the bus. But I have to say that my favorite example, and all of us, and in our preparation for this webinar today, we've certainly talked about how creative we get, and I know Tanya will have another good example, but in what I have found repeatedly in these small counties, we have a lot of immigrants, Mexican, Central American immigrants, and when the priority of the law is to place children with kin, if they can't be reunited with their parents, sometimes I've had a number of cases over the past years where we have totally legitimate kin, let's say in Mexico, and literally the county departments of social services are like, oh no, that's a different country. We absolutely can't do that. So one of the things I'm probably most proud of in my work in the past few years is establishing a really fabulous connection with the Mexican consulate here in Colorado. And the consulate is in Denver, and I'm 250 miles. But they have rallied together both with me, with the Defense Council, and with some of the county departments to help provide, for example, if one of our parents has gotten deported, we've had the consulate partner with us to help find treatment resources in Mexico so that these parents could actually do their treatment and not lose their parental rights. When we had a perfectly legitimate aunt and uncle and cousins who wanted to take in these children in Mexico, the Mexican consulate worked with the local county of human or not county, region of human services in Chihuahua to actually complete a home study. And we got documents of a very legitimate home study in order to try to help convince the department that I've said this before, but kin is kin. And in fact, from Colorado, Mexico is actually geographically closer than New York is. So it's not that outrageous, but it is, it's an out of the box kind of a way to do that. But what's been really gratifying is that over the course of time, in some of these cases, then the county departments, the professionals realize, wait a minute, these people at the consulate can help us too. And they've called me and asked for the contacts, and the people at the consulate are ready, willing, and able. So I encourage everybody in all the places that you are to think about rallying those kind of resources for infrastructure, as well as simple things, right? Like $10 Comcast, if you have to have Comcast, for low-income families and things like that.
Thank you. Donya, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I was thinking of a current case that I have. I'm working with a mom. She's a recent DV victim, and we were able to find her a bed in a domestic violence shelter in another county. So that's a struggle, when you start crossing county borders and what have you, to getting them transportation and what have you. And she's 38 weeks pregnant. So, and she's supposed to be on bed rest. And then initially the department was like, well, the bus stop is a block and a half, which doesn't sound like that far. But for someone who's very, very pregnant, a block and a half is a very long way. And so this is one of those cases that I had to approach, I guess, in a tactful way, because number one, mom was not getting good nutrition where she was living. They weren't allowing her to use the stove or the fridge. And so she was eating out of a box in a bag, and her blood sugar, she's like borderline, gestational diabetes now. And, which recently they did diagnose her with gestational diabetes. So we finally get her into this shelter bed. And now it's like she has, an EBT card for food, her food stamps. But how is she going to get that? The nearest bus stop is a block and a half. So it's like getting people to rally around that instead of just checking those boxes back to that is, well, she needs a ride to the grocery store and back. Her services are in another county. We're able to get those virtual, of course, right? But then her family time, the visits were reduced to 1 a week because of the distance. And we're like, no, that's not going to work. She's, struggling with depression and what have you. She needs to see her child more rather than less. And so, we just had to really come together as a team. But it was more of, I kind of put in an email to the department caseworker. This is what I need you to do, and then the coordinator, this is what, if you could do this would be great. And just kind of assigning people things to do. So everybody had one thing to bring together to the team. And today she has what she needs in that space, but it's like not not having those conversations. It just doesn't happen.
Thank you. Tanya, what does it look like when you are at a staffing, one of the many staffings the department has, where you're not agreeing with them and it gets to be maybe an adversarial situation, and it's the same person that you're going to be working with next week and the next week and the next week? How do you solve those scenarios?
Well, first, before we go in, I usually try to talk with the parent and prep them a little bit. And they usually feel very, very small sitting in those meetings, but I ask I ask permission if I could be their voice until they can find theirs, and then I find that the less a voice a parent has, the more conversations are had around them, about them, and not with them. And so I try to bring it back to the parent and give them an opportunity to be a part of that process. However, if we're not agreeing, then sometimes it's like ending that formal meeting. We just have to agree to disagree and let's just go our ways. But then I can find in my rural counties, we can have those hallway conversations, like, hey, can we be more candid now that we're not in this official meeting with a facilitator? And how can we move from point A to point B with this parent? How can we meet this parent where they're at, And because in the rural counties or rural areas that I work in, they don't want to see all these motions filed, but if it has to be done, it has to be done. And I've said things like, you know what, we can work with this parent right now, otherwise it's going to be the defense team filing a motion. And then we're going to be in court. We're going to be having the same conversations. And then sometimes they're like, well, let's look at this. You know what I mean? And so sometimes it's having that. I've even said, when we were in a meeting with with the department caseworker, and it didn't go well. And I know the department practices a different way, or I know that this case could go a different direction. I've had no problem going to the supervisor afterwards and say, listen, you don't like to be in the newspaper. Guess what? This is a situation that we could partner on, and it always perks their ears, but then we can have a conversation, and we can move forward.
Thank you. Lucia, do you have thoughts?
I was just cracking up at Tanya's reference to not wanting to be in the news. That's a little bit of hardball, Tanya. But you and I work so much. When I listen to you talk, you and I work so much the same, and I'll bet so many of the people in the audience do too. Because I always try very hard to establish some trust with the parent first before we go into those meetings. Prep them, like you said, Tanya, that, frequently they feel small, if not invisible, around 10 professionals around a room, around a table. But I will say that, we certainly do, unfortunately, have disagreements. And I'm right in the thick of a case right now where tiny little county, and for a very strange set of reasons that are, honestly, it feels as though the guardian ad litem and the caseworker are like Lucy and Charlie Brown, where they keep moving the goalposts. It was a no fault. Dad's been 100% compliant with the treatment plan for 9 months. Clean as a whistle. Again, it was a no fault. It was a different set of circumstances. And they keep adding and adding and adding really major things to the treatment plan. And the child's been in foster care the whole time, yet they can identify not a single safety issue. They're adding things like, oh, dad has to get a neuropsych, and now we have to have a parent-child interactional, which is this ugly new tool that they like to use in Colorado to try to leverage kids away from their parents. And all of this, we keep saying, well, what are the safety concerns? You know, the law. And apparently the guardian ad litem perceives that there is a lack of attunement. So this has turned into exactly what you're describing, Tanya, which is just a war of motions, and ugly emails. And so this is one of those cases that's gone the wrong way, where there wasn't room, which we tried diligently, the attorney and I, early on, to have those conversations and to say, not necessarily that you're going to be on TV, but look, here's a safe, fit parent. He isn't perfect. No. Show me a perfect parent. Really. You know, the attorney lives in Breckenridge, which I'm sure most of you know is a fancy ski area. Knock on doors in Breckenridge and see which parents possibly have some perceived attachment or attunement problem with their children, you know? So unfortunately, even in rural counties, sometimes we do get into these wars, which doesn't help anybody, and least of all the child. But I would add one thing, which is family advocates, parent advocates, defense social workers were new to Colorado. A little over 3 years ago, first officer respondent parent did a pilot, and then they started hiring independent consultants like I am. And at the beginning, many of the departments were put off by having an extra social worker or family advocate, some kind of advocate on the case. It was like, wait, we can do our jobs. We don't need you. And over time, I'm really grateful that that's switched, because in more cases than not, we do work as a team, and we do collectively help to reunify families. And the departments have recognized, oh, this is a great extra set of hands. And we all have the same goal, and that's something that I do all the time. I remind everybody on the case, the caseworkers, the guardian ad litem, everyone, look, technically I'm not a mandatory reporter now. I'm not a social worker. I work for the defense in a confidential relationship. But all I care about, the essence of my entire career of 30 years, is what's in the best interest of the children. And I think frequently when you remind team members of that we all care about the children and the families, that can really help just a lot.
Thank you. Before we move on, I'm just looking at the chat a little bit, and I do want to acknowledge the discussion from what it looks like to be attorneys that are talking about them having to do good social work as well. I know Mary Odie particularly well, and she's one of the best attorney/social workers I know. And I understand that happens in urban areas as well, but it is probably an added duty that you didn't get taught in law school, would be my guess. Okay, so moving on, Lucia, being in rural areas, you're much more visible, whether you're at the Sinclair, I think we talked to you one day, you're in front of or the grocery store.
I was up in Fairplay on the Continental Divide, yep.
Yeah, So how do you choose professionally and personally, I guess, to be involved in community activities or even going out, like when you have not just parents, but providers, so forth, that you're going to run into when those of us in urban areas probably don't have to worry about or think about? How do you deal with some of those scenarios?
So obviously, we prepared for this, and I knew that I was going to have this question, and I had a flashback to when I was very first a caseworker in a tiny little county way up in the mountains in Colorado. And I was quite a bit younger and pretty naive. And my husband and I, it was a Friday night, and, again, teeny little town, and we just went to the bar with some friends. We had some friends visiting, and I walked into this old-fashioned bar in Leadville, Colorado, for those of you who know it. And I was literally heckled and screamed by a number of the patrons at the bar because they knew who I was. And I had perhaps been involved in taking one of their children into protective custody, and it was excruciating for me. I didn't see it coming. And from that point on, I never went out in that town, and I made my husband go to the grocery store with me, or go to the grocery store for me, rather. But I think that in my certain circumstance, I work in a lot of different counties, and so I don't, oddly, well, not really oddly, because again, I live in a tiny community, but I don't get cases really in my own local community. And so I don't get too involved in all of these different communities because I don't live there. So I go and see the clients, I go and participate in the court. And I've also found that to be a bit of a hindrance in my work because I'm going to so many places, I don't have thorough knowledge of the resources in each community. And I think that that's a downfall because things like housing programs and food banks and special programs, thankfully, obviously, there are people with feet on the ground, and that's where we work too with the local counties to find out about those resources. But I would say to you that I think it can be a slippery slope, being too closely involved in the community, but a double-edged sword, because it would be excellent to know more about the resources. But I would imagine, I can't look at it right now, but I think the chat would have a lot to say about this. Tanya, what about you?
As far as being connected in the community, well, first of all, I just want to clarify on the whole newspaper thing. I don't pull that out of my pocket all the time, only when needed, okay?
It just cracked me up, that's all.
Yeah, and I'll say things too, like, it'd be really helpful if your supervisor was part of this meeting, or something like that. But we try to work with each other because we do have to see each other regularly. But as far as being involved in the community, I also live a life of recovery. So I like to be connected in as many avenues as, people that I work with. However, still have good boundaries where I can go home and just be home and shut my door and be good, right? But resources, I love to hear that because I was in a training not too long ago and somebody referred to me as a resource broker. I think I like that. I like to know what's going on in my community. I like everyone else to know what's going on in the community. And I just like to be in the know. If there's something new, how can we partner? How can we expand? How can we get creative with your new service or resource in our community, which I just found one last week. And first thing I do when I find out something new is I send it out to all my attorneys. I want my attorneys to know so every parent can get this, access to this, So, and I kind of look at that a different way too, because in my communities, in my counties I work, I try to be involved in committees and boards or commissions or movements or whatever it is, anything that can directly impact the parents we work with, on the ground. There's plenty of committees and boards out there, but if it doesn't directly impact the parents I work with, then I just don't really have time for that. But anything that I can get creative or get somebody else to get creative about to work with the parent, hey, we don't have to have a cookie cutter system, as much as we work in one. I don't work in one. I don't work in a silo, margins. I like to walk all over the lines, whatever it is, just to, I was talking with another OP social worker recently about, we're talking about somebody staying in their lane and somebody else concerned about somebody else's lane. And she goes, OPD social workers, we drive all over the freeway. And that's about sums it up.
Very good. Let me interject a little story about Tanya. I've had the privilege of working with her and getting to know her for several years now, and she's humble enough. She will not tell you this, but she carries lots of clout in the 2 counties she works in. The only person I know that when she enters the room, the judges and commissioners stand up straight and get a little scared. Tanya runs those counties. So speaking of that, Tanya, so you're next up, and how important is it for you to be seen with the parents in court and sitting with them in meetings or even times you're with them and providers as the non-attorney, as the interdisciplinary staff? How do you feel like that impacts the case?
I think it does just greatly, because the judge or the judicial officer automatically knows that they're going to get double the efforts around that parent. And I like to sit next to the parent as much as I can so they feel supported. But there have been cases where somebody's struggling or something and the judge will have me say my name and contact information in open court. And they're like, if you don't know Tanya, you need to know Tanya. And I'm like, okay, who's their attorney? You know what I mean? Because I can't get referrals from everybody, but I absolutely will do what a judge says. There's that. I have an attorney that called me out on the sidewalk one day and said, oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, last week we had a hearing on so-and-so. And they were moving to file term, and I asked for continuance, and they weren't going to grant it. But I told the judge, I'm bringing Tanya McClanahan on the case. Can I get a continuance? And he granted him a continuance for that. And I'm like, okay, good to know, But, and there's just I think having a presence, too. I think back to a case where there was a dad and they kept saying he wasn't in compliance and he kept struggling to get his medical straightened out and nobody was helping him. And we were sitting in court and they were using against him that he wasn't engaged in treatment. He didn't even have an assessment yet, and he technically did not have insurance. So my mind is, if he doesn't have insurance, the department should be paying for it, right? So there's cases going on in court, and I just get on my laptop. And I got dad's name and birth date and everything. And I entered it all in and boom, ran that through. And within a few minutes, he had insurance. So I walk up and I tap the attorney on the shoulder and I just showed her my laptop. And she goes, oh, wait, Your Honor. So the case went differently just for something so simple as me sitting in court and doing the work. It took all of 2 minutes. And the judge, he made that very plain and clear on the record. Well, Ms. McClanahan sat here in less than 2 minutes and got this dad's insurance. So now he can start treatment. I'm not going to find him in non-compliance. I mean, stuff like that is just magical. And it's like, if I could sit there for 2 minutes and just help a parent stay in a positive mode and move forward, that's huge.
Thank you. And Lucia, I don't know you as well, but I've heard equally as great things about you. So I want to give you that.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice of you, Mike. We live in different states. How would you know me? But just to add on to what Tanya said, for me, being in the court with the clients makes a huge difference. Again, it's that relationship piece and them feeling extra supported, especially when perhaps they're in a court where there is a slightly adverse relationship with the caseworker or the judge. They feel like the parents feel like they have someone on their side. And I think that's a great example, Tanya, your little finding insurance in 2 minutes, that there are little things that we can do in the back of the room. I mean, in a drastic situation, I've been so bold as to pass a little note to the attorney, because maybe he or she has overlooked something that happened that they need to present to the court that's critical. We all do that. And so I do think it's really valuable. And I think in my small communities, we always have the same judge. And it's valuable for the judges to get to know us and to understand that there are these additional resources for the defense counsel that can really help support parents, and that we're all about reunification. I think it's incredibly valuable. I just want to jump really quick, Mike. I saw that Mary OT asked about rural counties doing clients using oral swab drug tests, and I'm going to answer it because we have a client actually in the very deep sticks, far away from everything, and a half-hour round trip for this woman who suffers from schizophrenia to drive into a town to give a UA, but she can go to a little town that's only a half an hour away, and they're using oral drug swabs, and the court won't accept it. Mm. So, Mary, that's my experience with it.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Very.
Okay, so I'm going to throw you a little curveball here, and we're going to go through Aldina's questions if you're okay with it. So in smaller communities, it's not uncommon for a judge or commissioner to have been there for a while and know either your client or the family in several different ways. How do you think that impacts cases in terms of them having that knowledge, kind of historical knowledge with the family? Either of you can go first.
I can think of one case that I got the one sister, and then shortly thereafter I got the other sister. And I remember this case very plain and clear because it was the very first relative I ever kind of basically told him to take a step back because I couldn't have a conversation with this mom without him interfering. And I had to kind of put him in his place. And later on, people were telling me, Tanya, I'm surprised you're still standing. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And they're like, those are Saw's daughters. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, I guess there was a crime he committed in town involving a chainsaw. And so they referred to him as Saw and all his kids as Saw's children. They didn't even have their own identity. And they'd walk in the courthouse and they go, oh, here comes one of Saw's daughters, and it was just like, and I didn't quite understand at the beginning, which is fine because I try to take the parent for who they are right there in front of me. And that's how I try to get everybody else to see them as well. But that carried, I guess that incident happened like 15, 20 years ago, and they still carry it so bad that the dad changed all their last names, but it's a small community. They still know who they are, so there's that, or I just see that, I mean, I can think of another case where it's just one of the worst DV cases I've ever worked with. And mom tried so many times to file a protection order, and she would withdraw or he would just violate. It was just a constant ugly situation. So finally we got advocates and people around mom and went with her to file this protection order, and the judge wouldn't rule for one. He said, I've known both of you for, so many years, and this is back and forth, and this has been what you guys have done. I'm not going to order a protection order. I was appalled that they weren't treated for the situation and what was going on at the time, but that's rural counties, and, you don't have time to sit and waller and be ticked off about something. It's like, okay, I'm ticked off, I'm fueled up now, but we got to figure out a way to move on, a workaround or something, So it does impact, I think, greater than urban areas.
Lucia?
Right, because in the urban areas, the judges don't have the luxury of remembering all those families and 2 or 3 generations and Shaw's daughters. Horrible but great story. But again, I'll refer back to used before. It's a blessing and a curse, right? Because in the court I gave an example of where we recently formed the family drug court in Fremont County, this magistrate seems to appreciate when he knows, he to one of our moms recently who got her kids back, thank goodness, full custody, a beautiful story. He was like, look, I've known you since you were 10 and I know you can do this. And he's really personally pulling, and you see it for almost all of the parents who come in front of him. But in another county, old time judge, and it's a really difficult situation because, and this judge hears all the cases, and furthermore, it's always the same guardian ad litem. It's always the same caseworkers because I think there's only 2 in the county. And this judge, he kind of wants to be everybody's best friend. And so I have a case I've worked on for 2 years. It's such a sad situation, but obviously this judge knows the child, knows the father and stepmother, and they walk it when we were still in court in person. They walk into the court, and even before it's on the record, hey, how you doing, buddy? And oh, I saw you eating dinner at Quincy's the other night. And this father doesn't want to be impolite, but he's in agony. He's in agony because he's having to go to court. His daughter's in custody, in foster care, and now resident for years. And he's agonizing. And so it doesn't serve sometimes when the judge is trying to be personable and personal because they know the people. And somehow there seems to be a disconnect that, wait a minute, these people are in my court because their children have been taken away. And by the same token, same judge, he's super chummy with the guardian ad litem and the caseworker and the county attorney. And this same father who is so offended by all of this, he gets mad every single time we have court, even on Zoom, because he's like, oh, that judge, and those are his Charlie's Angels, and because it just looks too friendly, and you would not ever see that in a rural court. I don't believe, from my experience.
Thank you. Are there, how has COVID impacted your practice, either negatively or positively? And are there things that have come out, if positive, you think will be carried on and could be helpful for future clients?
I'm hoping. And I would say that because in the beginning, I think the nation, the world was kind of in shock and not understanding what was going on. But I will say that our state and our government stepped up with some push. I'll say a lot of push come from OPD to get, I'm drawing a blank right now, but, just technical devices for these parents to have family time, to do their services and what have you. And that seems to be, if a parent doesn't have a phone or a laptop or something, it seems like we're able to get that get that for them now within the week, which that didn't even exist before, so I'm grateful for that. I don't ever like to hear a parent that doesn't have a working phone or minutes on their phone or what have you. We will get that, hopefully within a week. The best thing I like, and I hope it sticks, is some kind of hybrid, is because I can get a new case. I can get them an SUD assessment, a mental health assessment, and an inpatient bed. Here about 2-3 weeks ago, I got all that within less than 24 hours for a mom. That pre-COVID, that didn't happen. Sometimes, to get all 3 of those, we're talking weeks, or a month or two. But I myself call those inpatient centers sometimes daily, because what I found is the treatment centers, if I let their counselor know that, hey, there's a bed open at such and such location, they've already got an internal list. And I don't want them to go through that list. I tell them, I'm not telling you where the bed is because I want my parent to have it first, and that's how I do my resources. I'll partner with you, but I don't want them on your list because my parent's going to get that next, and so having those kind of conversations. Also, I feel like there's more attendance to services and resources, and where parents can, because a lot of parents, they don't have housing, transportation, or communication means, so if we got them a communication means and they're out in the boonies, they can at least walk to the road and get internet service to call in or get on Zoom to do their classes or their court, so I feel like there's more involvement, there's more participation that way. It's a sad thing, but I kind of hope that is still around for parents to have access to, is to, to be able to call in or Zoom in, so to say.
Lucia?
I agree with everything that Tanya said. From my point of view, I believe unofficially that we've had a lot more consistent participation in things by parents. We use WebEx in Colorado, and like you say, Tanya, getting the virtual services seems to be a little bit easier, although I'll say we have such incredibly limited treatment providers, both for mental health and substance abuse use in the rural areas I work in. They're overloaded even with Zoom therapy, but the very obvious downside is when I get a new case, the first thing I would do is go meet that client as soon as possible and talk to them and explain to them who I am and let them get an understanding of that I'm on their side, that I have a confidential relationship, that I'm here to support them in every possible way. And it's very challenging to get that same level of trust established through a telephone call or a Zoom. And so many of my parents, like Tony says, have limited minutes or not enough bandwidth. We can't set up a Zoom call, which I do with a lot of the attorneys that I work with, because we've all learned through COVID, right, that it's easier to see each other when we're talking with each other. So, there's pluses and minuses, and I think it'll be challenging as we go forward, right? Because just right now, as everybody's like, wait, do we wear a mask? No, it's going to be this interesting, like you said, maybe a hybrid, Tanya. And I think that the courts and the departments of social services are going to have to establish pretty clear guidelines for parents, because in a way, yeah, especially for parents in rural areas, it's much easier to just click on your phone and have the family engagement meeting and then click it off and go do your stuff. It saves a lot of time. It saves a lot of money and gas and what have you. So those are good things. But if it's going to be a hybrid, we're going to have pretty clear understanding with all of those things. And I think that'll be extra challenging with the small courts. I know in my most immediate judicial district, we've just started in-person court again. And a couple of the judges have expressed in the past 2 days, actually, it's really great to see everyone. And this really matters in dependency and neglect cases, to have the parties present. And I would agree with that. I don't feel like the new cases that I've gotten over the past year or so, I have nearly the relationship with the parents as I do with some of my older cases.
Thank you. It feels like to me that each dependency case is its own kind of little checkers game, and trying to figure out the progress versus compliance issue. And I feel strongly that most child welfare agencies really hammer home the progress or the compliance piece versus the progress piece. Do you feel like with Zoom services, whether they be parenting classes or whatever they are, that parents are getting as much out of those in a progress way, or not? Meaning, are some parents responding to it in a way that they're really addressing their parental deficiencies, and they use that in quotes?
Well, I think yes and no, because I think that the judgment of progress is not as heavy because you can only do so much in these times, and so if someone gets ordered to a hands-on in-person service and that service is not going into the home, how can you hold that against the parent would be my concern. Like someone's referencing, homeless people not having access to internet or phone chargers. I think that goes back on the department. How can you hold a parent in compliance or not, or progress or not, on something that is totally out of their control when the department can provide that? Same thing as services. I mean, we do hear cases where the department is trying to say they're not making progress. They're not showing that they're applying their new skills and this and that. Well, then I would challenge the Department of Social Work. Are you in the home to watch that firsthand? Well, no, because we're on limited schedule. There's only so many of us in the office. Then how do you expect a service provider to do something you're not doing? And how can you hold that against the parent? There's only the parameters of what is available. It's kind of like going outside the box to charge somebody for something inside the box, and it's just, no. I'm glad we have good OPD attorneys to make those arguments.
Mike, I really like the distinction you make between progress and compliance, because that is just so frequently overlooked. And I would say that in our COVID world, I do think progress is more readily overlooked because everything is so two-dimensional, right? When we have family engagement meetings, typically if the treatment providers actually join in at all, it's for a very limited time, and they don't have necessarily the luxury, or they don't want to do Zoom. So they call in and say, yes, mother has attended 10 sessions, and there were 3 hot UAs over the past 3 months, but they're not necessarily seeing the luxury of having that person come in and saying, okay, what caused the slip? What can we do? The 3-dimensionality of living and working to try to overcome an addiction or to improve your parenting skills. I mean, parenting classes online, I'm not sure how effective that is, and how do we genuinely measure progress? I mean, it is very subjective, of course, but I do think that it's not as readily obvious in what's become this dimensional world, and I think that will hopefully be enriched as we go on and things open up again.
I have seen some discussion across Washington State where a department social worker has inferred that the parent that completes a service during COVID over Zoom is probably going to need to take that again when we get back to the real world. Have you had have you got that sense from any of the department caseworkers you worked with?
I haven't yet. I've heard some whispers of that. And to me, I go back to the Department of Social Worker is not an expert in that. And if that provider is giving them a certificate of completion or graduation, then that is what they're getting. And it's not a partial completion or a partial graduation. They've either completed it or they haven't, and so to make them redo something like that, why'd they do it to begin with? I mean, I think that'd be up for great argument. I don't see that so much happening in my rural areas because I feel like they're understanding more on the ground of, it's kind of like saying, well, you as a department caseworker during COVID, you didn't come into the office for 6 months. So that 6 months of your work doesn't count. I mean, that's how I would kind of flip it back, I don't know. Good luck on that one, in my areas anyway.
And thankfully, Mike, I haven't heard, touch wood, right? Maybe they haven't thought of it yet. I haven't heard anybody in Colorado, in any of my areas, or from my colleagues on the Front Range, that kind of idea. Talk about moving the goalpost. That's just, repeat it because it wasn't real. That's, I would say, rather inexcusable. But I hope we don't come to that.
Okay, thank you. We do have a few questions, and I'm just going to throw them out. Gwendolyn asked, how do you build relationships in rural counties to effectively represent your parent client?
That's one of my favorite parts. In my rural counties, we have to often agree to disagree. And, after court, we're walking, pre-COVID, we're walking down the sidewalk to have lunch at the local diner together. So those conversations are being had and, having lunch. Or what I do often, like this new resource, sounds like they're a service provider that I just briefly talked to on the phone and found last week. We've already set up a Zoom meeting and we've already scheduled for the first week of July a time to go have lunch, because I want to know them and I want them to know me, and how can we partner and create beyond what you offer? I'm already thinking that way, how they can help the parents and what have you. And, I think just having those conversations, those candid conversations out in the hallway, down the sidewalk, at the diner, popping into their office to see how they're doing, those little personable things, like if I'm at the department for a different meeting, I'm going to pop in my head to the other offices that the doors are open and just say, hey, how you doing? Do we have any cases you want to talk about? And 9 times out of 10, there's some of their personal stuff comes up, but it's building that relationship, and every once in a while, there'll be one that just not quite there. So I try to include them and their supervisor and hey, I've heard there's this really good training around this, and this. Do you think we can bring that to your office soon? Because what I'm saying is basically your social worker and your department social worker just ain't getting it. Can we get together and have a training on this? And that kind of thing. And it just comes across as partnering, and like I said, there's a lot of conversations that happen over the tables at the local diner.
We'll move on to the next question, but I did acknowledge Stephanie's chat comment about the little overall impact. In Washington State, we had a study a few years back asking department social workers what they thought families needed and asking the parents what they needed on the same case. And it was really interesting, the huge difference, probably not unexpected. But the social workers were kind of this esoteric type of, they need this service to help them to do whatever. And parents were like, I need housing help. I need food. I need that. And really, that's hard to do in a system that has a lot of people and a lot of money and a lot of jobs. And there's an incentive to keep that structure in place. And that's, I think, the fight for all of us. Okay, just my little editorial there. Moving on to...
I liked your editorial, Mike. I have to add, I did this because what you said and Stephanie's comment, it just immediately reminds me of Maslow, right? Basic needs, right? We don't need our parents to reach enlightenment. We just need them to have a roof over their head and food to feed their children and a sense of safety. And they can go a long, long way. And it's when she says what helps improving parenting the most is supporting their basic needs. This harkens back to the case that I've been talking about. As I told you, this perceived lack of attachment. well, why don't you put the child back at home and he can bond with his father better? It's a pretty simple equation. If there's no safety risks, let them become parent and child. I'll stop.
Our child welfare system started over 50 years ago to deal with sex abuse and serious physical abuse cases. Neglect was not even part of that original discussion. And now over 80% of cases, neglect is the primary piece. And it's where and how we changed in that, I don't know. But I can tell you every time, and we're going to face it again this year in Washington State, every time the legislators give them more workers, there's more kids picked up. And that's the piece that needs to stop, right? The question, the answer for a lot of people is they need more money. In my mind, they need less money. They'll pick up less kids if that happens. But okay, so we will move on real quick to the questions. Stephanie asked, how do you prioritize which rural areas you focus in?
I don't understand exactly. As us as workers?
Yeah, I would imagine, and Stephanie can chime in if she'd like, but I would imagine that that attorneys and probably some of the interdisciplinary staff have multiple counties that they have to serve, some farther away than others, and the challenges of balancing that out when you got some really rural areas.
I think, if I understand it right, I would just gauge, number one, travel time, number, two, how much I have to put into those cases, just balancing that with, because I live in one county, I work in two counties, I've had courtesy cases, a courtesy case, they're two counties beyond my furthest county, and so on, I just have to gauge around hearings, around needs, around crises, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Lucia, do you have thoughts?
Well, I'm reading Stephanie's comments, and she adds, when determining where to focus resources and legal support, in Kansas, we have so many rural areas. I hear you, Stephanie. For me, really, it's case dependent. And I probably do exactly what Tanya does. Just try to gauge if I can do a circle, a big 400-mile circle, and see 3 clients, or it's really case dependent. I guess I don't have much more than that on that question.
I bounce some of that off the attorney as well. Like if I'm working, 3 or 4 intense cases this week, as you know, with working with people, crises comes up, and something comes up. Like 2 weeks ago, I had 3 moms all of a sudden in really bad domestic violence situations. So guess what? My whole calendar got slid over. My focus was on those 3 now. And getting them safe and stable and what have you. And so I think it's just very fluid, and it's very moving, day to day. If I'm supposed to be in court, and something comes up that I need to be at, then I will try to, at least have a conversation with the parent beforehand. Sorry, I can't be there. This is, what is it you would like the attorney to know, and, speak on behalf, and then check in with the attorney. I try to always keep my attorneys, on top of what I'm doing or not doing, because they're the ones advocating in court, and I can do all the running around behind the scenes, but I want to make sure that my attorneys are prepared as much as possible when they're standing there in court. One thing I don't ever like to hear is, Your Honor, I have nothing to add. I have made no contact. That just drives a nail in my spine. So whatever it takes for me to get in touch with that parent and make sure that attorney can at least say something. Even if they say, I don't have anything to add, Your Honor, I know Tanya's been in communication with them. Just something, so I think it's just a fluid conversation every day.
Okay. Aaron asks, how are your offices set up? Do you have staff attorneys, or are cases assigned to attorneys on a panel list?
My office is a spare bedroom in my home. And my second office is my vehicle. And I have internet passwords to the different county courthouses that I am in. And I'm usually, non-COVID times, I'm a mobile unit. Usually the only time I'm home is when I come home to shut my door.
In Colorado, we are all independent consultants, and my office is the same as Tanya's, an extra room and my car, which is used to be my primary office before COVID. But in the rural areas, the attorneys have individual independent practices. We all contract with the Office of Respondent Parent Counsel. I will say, however, in the Front Range communities, in the large communities, Denver, Boulder, Aurora, etc., there are attorney firms that hire all social workers, parent advocates, and family advocates to be on staff. So that's really a huge difference between, in Colorado anyway, the rural and the urban areas, because in the urban areas, many of the attorneys have a whole staff. And so every case can get this extra attention. In my case, and I think in Tanya's, we get these cases when an individual recognizes that they could use, that an interdisciplinary team would be preferable. And I don't exactly want to speak for her, and I know we're out of time, but Alina, who was going to be part of this, and we miss her very much, she, as an attorney, told us early on that she wishes that she had social workers and advocates on her staff, but she doesn't. So hopefully that'll evolve.
So we have one last question that I see from the wonderful Jill Cohen, my friend and colleague and the godmother of interdisciplinary practice. How do we encourage rural attorneys to bring on social workers and parent advocates onto their teams? Programs and money seem to reach rural places late in the game, so I don't blame them for being skeptical, but we need their buy-in. Thoughts on that?
That's my Jill. Jill is also my leader and my friend and a wonderful person, and she is the godmother of interdisciplinary teams. I wish that's what I've been begging for. I wish so much that more of the rural attorneys would recognize that we can help. I think part of the problem is just that these attorneys have been working in their own practice for a really long time, and they're not familiar with multidisciplinary teams. They don't necessarily recognize the advantage that a social worker or an advocate could bring to their case. I guess perhaps one answer, Jill, is personal outreach. Maybe those of us in the field could do more personal outreach to the attorneys, and those of you at the Office of Respondent Parent Counsel could. It's a really question. Maybe Tanya has a thought on it.
Well, my take is that the best advocacy is when you work really hard on one case and they're sitting in court and the other attorneys are like, how do I get her? Or how did you get all that? Or I like to back them up into things like, I'll hear a difficult case in court and I'm like, so what's going on with this case? Well, this dad lives out here and this is what's going on. And I'm like, well, I could do that. And that's stuff that I do. And I do that stuff all the time, and they're like, you can, but, just presenting that you could take a load off of the attorney and do all that running around, I think most attorneys I've worked with, they enjoy that extra running around, and I can't tell you how many times I've sat in court and the attorney's like panicking, like, oh my gosh, where's this dad? Where's this mom? They're supposed to be here in court. I haven't heard from them. If I can jump in my car and go pick them up and come back before the judge comes out on the bench, win-win, but you don't see attorneys doing that, so those kind of things, I don't want to say that some attorneys are able to do that, but by showing those are the extra things, or sitting back there in court and applying that dad for medical insurance, those kind of things. Then other attorneys are like, wow, she just saved this case and where the direction this was going by being on her laptop for 2 minutes.
Okay, before we wrap up, is there any parting thoughts either of you would like to leave with?
I saw a comment earlier from Isenia. I may or may not be pronouncing that right. I think she's in Pennsylvania, and she made a comment that the guardian ad litem and the Department of Families owed Pennsylvania part of their paycheck, and I see some of that in Colorado, where the guardian ad litem is aligned with the department, and it just becomes, instead of working towards reunification, it becomes this contest of right and wrong and winning and losing in a civil case that's looking at the child's best interest. And it's such an honor to work on these cases, and I just think the more that we can do what Tanya and I are talking about, and like talk to all the parties and make relationships, and try to smooth out ruffled feathers, we have a much greater chance of success. And multidisciplinary teams are the answer. There's not a question in my mind. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I thank you for this opportunity, and any other questions or comments, I'm sure you can get a hold of Mike and he can get those to me.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
I want to thank both of you for adjusting on the fly. I was a little flustered when we started. We were trying to figure this out a minute before it happened. I
just want to say that we missed Alina. It's a real shame that we didn't have her with us.
Yes, she's a wonderful personality, and I think you all would have enjoyed her. And I want to thank everybody that participated. You're on the right side of history. You're all doing the right thing, and we're all in this together. Issues that you're facing wherever you are, somebody else in Parents Rep is facing it someplace else, and creating that community and making the world a little smaller for us is what this is all about. And thank you, and thanks for attending.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.